So anyways, this week we're talking about COINTELPRO, which is shorthand for counterintelligence program coming out of the FBI. Like I said, we're just going to focus on kind of an overview and how it relates to the repression of indigenous movements. I think what's really important to think about is to put this into historical context. The FBI, was created and founded in 1919. But before I get into that, I want to kind of set the stage a little bit historically, and why, as indigenous peoples, indigenous leftists and Marxists, we need to study the arms of the state. And I just want to put forward like a theory of imperialism into understanding the machinations of the police state, because it's important to remember that the primary mode of repression of indigenous peoples at the founding of the settler republic was the U.S. military. And in fact, there are 14 battle streamers on the U.S. Army flag that represent the so-called Long War against indigenous people. The first battle streamer is 1791, and the last one is 1891. So over 100 years of war against indigenous people. In 1891 also kind of marks a transition. You have, the Dawes Allotment Act being pushed through. You have the inauguration of the reservation period, as it's known. The Dawes Allotment Act, basically put up for sale to white settlers around 270 million acres of territory, which was devastating to tribes. And that acreage is about the size of the state of Montana, so it was a huge land grab. But it didn't just happen because Native people were like hapless victims. There was resistance. There's, the Standing Rock Nation, the Lakota, the Oceti Sakowin adamantly resisted allotment the first time it came around, and only subsequently agreed to allotment because their children were taken and sent to off-reservation boarding schools. But also what was implemented was what was called the Civilization Regulations, which is essentially a series of internal circulars that were sent out by the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, regulating daily aspects of Native life. That included anything from speaking language, practicing your ceremonies, sun dancing, and even I found this one which was really fascinating. It was about how to butcher a cow and how to butcher and the kinds of things that Native people were allowed to eat. So there was a ban on eating organ meats because it was considered savage and it was considered barbaric. So like everything down to our diets, to our governance structures was micromanaged by the U.S. government, and they implemented what was called the courts of criminal offense, or courts of Indian offenses, which one could be brought up on, and as punishment they could be jailed or imprisoned, or they could have their rations withheld. So it was a starvation policy. And you also see at this moment in time the professionalization of the Indian Scout Service, it's not really a service, but Indian Scouts, who were kind of auxiliaries to the U.S. military, becoming actual police forces on the reservations at this time. And it might just be, we can look at it through the lens of settler colonialism, which is incredibly important, and thinking about how these regulations weren't just about physically killing Native people, but culturally, politically, economically destroying them as nations. And to kind of put that into a little bit of perspective, if you think about the Black Hills case, which the Lakota Nation, the Oceti Sakowin, has refused, has brought a charge against the United States saying that the Black Hills was illegally taken, right? And they were sold or given away under a seller-starve policy. Essentially, we would get our treaty annuities revoked had we not agreed to selling the Black Hills. It's a whole case. We should do an entire episode on it. It's really worth thinking about. But what happened, though, because of that case, but also because of the mounted resistance that specifically the Oceti Sakowin, but also other indigenous nations like the Apache, the Comanche, had fomented against the United States, and it was successful. You know, they defeated the U.S. Army in open combat. There were generations of punishment, right, to force the hand and to eliminate indigenous leadership. So if we think about the blockade on Cuba, which is like 6 decades long, or we think about sanctions against, hostile or non-compliant nations, specifically like socialist nations, but others, we can think about this policy as being implemented against indigenous people, probably first and foremost, preventing us from developing our own government structure. In spite of all of this, in spite of, the economic, the political, the cultural assault on our nations for generations, over a century, almost a century and a half, we've refused to sell the Black Hills because it's not about money. It's about autonomy. It's about political rights. It's about sovereignty. It's about independence, right? And I think that's important to put into the conversation, because at the turn of the century, several decades before the FBI was even formed, there was a large influx of Western European immigrants who had been expelled from Europe during the revolutions, during the Paris Commune, etc., and were bringing what were considered alien ideologies like Marxism and communism. So a new way that Native people were being racialized and being targeted was because we held quote unquote communistic views. And there's plenty of evidence. I could do an entire podcast episode on that, about how these policies of allotment, which were meant to encourage private land ownership, these are policies of assimilation, of civilization, were actually attacking the tribe to break up this idea of common ownership of land, but also communalism within indigenous communities, because they weren't, I wouldn't say they were anti-capitalist, but they definitely were non-capitalist. And if we think about this in a Marxist sense, it's about the kind of economic drivers of why one takes land, and also providing a political alternative that sustains resistance through maintaining a distinct cultural base through language and nationality, but also because attacking Native nations, meant opening up the land on one hand, but also it meant forever like suspending the question of independence, the question of sovereignty, to a point where indigenous people, were confined to reservation life, and weren't allowed to really evolve. And I use that word, critically, but to evolve beyond the status of dependency on the, with the United States. But the other aspect of it, and looking at it from kind of an anthropological perspective, Marxist anthropological perspective, is that if we think about the way that indigenous nations had developed their culture, and it's not just culture in an abstract, we're talking about how resources were redistributed, how life was reproduced, how social life was reproduced, how harmony was desired or aspired to with what we call, in English, nature. There's no word for nature in Lakota Api. There's no external to human society, like we are nature and nature is us.
I mean, the closest thing that I think actually encapsulates what white people, want to like call nature is like glaciation, like that which moves. Like that's the only. Yeah, like that's the only thing that's comes to mind. And
but that concept includes us.
It's so much.
Well.
Yeah, exactly. Like I always say to white people, you need to stop thinking of yourselves as separate from nature or above nature. We are one with nature. And like what we do affects it.
Yeah, and if you think about it in terms of like base superstructure, and I know there's a lot of people who don't like that, but I'm all about that base. The base superstructure is that, this idea that human societies create their culture or their superstructure, their language, their religion, their law, their politics, based on their mode of production or their economy, how they actually sustain themselves on the land that they live and on this planet. And ours was a non-capitalist. Again, I'm not going to make the argument that we were anti-capitalist at this moment in time, but it was definitely non-capitalist, meaning...
Well, I mean, it's impossible to make that argument because, like, capitalism is just emerging at this moment as we see it today. Like, arguably, we could say anti-colonialist.
Yeah,
but
definitely anti-colonial.
Anti-capitalist is you're jumping the gun to a superstructure that doesn't exist yet.
Yeah.
You know?
And so they knock out the base, our non-capitalist way of living with the land, and they see the remnants of the superstructure through our language, our reciprocity, our communalism, the way we still had relations with the non-human world is the primary threat. And so they attack that base, right? And so I think it's important to set that up. The other aspect of it is thinking about imperialism and capitalism on a world scale, and especially the United States. The United States had the largest GDP in the world, not at the turn of the century, right, in the inauguration of the so-called American century, but in 1830 because of plantation slavery. So the imperialist project began way before, the kind of the typical American story of empire, says like with the Spanish-American War, etc. And what's important to remember about this is that it's operating on two fronts. One is, at the turn of the century, in the 19th century, the 20th century, it's operating on two fronts. It's looking at the kind of imperialist project abroad, building up its military. And arguably, we had an interview with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz about this. That began with the founding of this country. But for the sake of this podcast and this episode, I think it's important to think about how value is extracted from these other so-called colonies, overseas colonies, that the United States is creating and fortifying through overseas military bases, through interventions, through basically controlling the economic, political, and social livelihoods and destinies of other nations, and how it's extracting that value from there and creating what we now know as the first world, the most advanced capitalist nation in the world, which is the United States. But instead of redistributing that wealth, which it does to some degree, but it's not necessarily a social democracy or a social liberal democracy like Canada or the Nordic countries, it invests that money into two institutions that maintain its hegemony. The first one is the military, which we could talk about later. But I think for the purposes of this podcast, it's also the repressive apparatuses of the state, the agents of repression, to quote the book title of War Churchill. And so it's important to remember that, like, imperialism, there is an aristocracy of labor. There are workers in the first world that definitely benefit from imperialism. But anytime an alternative to that economic system arises, it's crushed by agents of repression, by police forces that seem to have never-ending, no limits on their budget and the amount of resources and impunity that they can mobilize at their expenses to crush any alternative that sort of arises in the domestic sphere. I don't know if you want to add anything to that. I could jump into the creation of the FBI and our homeboy
Ward.
Hoover.
Okay.
Hoover.
I'm just thinking about how Ward words it, which he places it with the Pinktons and stuff like that. But
yeah,
there's a bunch of different places you can start with the origins. But I think the most important thing to talk about is that dominating paranoia, mistrust, and almost fear of the state that is just prevalent throughout the society. That's right-wing libertarians. That's exactly what's wrong with them. They literally just fear the state, and oftentimes, anarchists, leftist anarchists or whatever, if you want to, make a difference between libertarian rights and libertarian lefts, they're just afraid of a state too, because they're so used to this, imperial project where, it literally seems like the crucible of their designs is the Indian Wars. When you look at Afghanistan and stuff, we've covered this multiple times now on the feed, specifically for the reason that it is so pertinent to the conversation right now. And when you even look at the major civil rights movements, of Indian people, those are the first ones getting called communists. You have a fishing rights struggle, and they're getting called communists.
Well, they get. This happens in in the 1910s when they formed the Society of American Indians, like they're getting labeled communistic because like the height, it's like 1917, the United States is entering, World War One. There's the Bolshevik Revolution, the Communist Revolution in Russia, and these American Indian activists are like, we need rights too. We're nations too, and they were getting labeled as like reds, essentially.
Well, like, I mean, better red than dead, has a very specific meaning to at least, indigenous people when they say it, at least communist indigenous people. Like there is very much a dual, like, hatred, so to say, that's just systemically intertwined with, but the FBI, just due to its origins, like, I mean, there's a fog of, like, disinformation, if you will. I mean, over-information, misdirection, whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's sort of like the whole goal of this series, is to sort of like fuss that out for people to understand better. But like, I don't know, COINTELPRO to me is like one of the more confusing projects, if you will, of the CIA, because it technically ends.
FBI, you mean?
FBI, yeah, sorry, not CIA. One of the alphabet agencies, but it ends, but it doesn't end. It continues on after 71, even though they released it. You know what I mean? Like they try to get ahead of the Citizens Committee. So it's like, when that.
Let's take it. Look as before we get into that. Let's do. I'll do a quick overview of the FBI and the formations and the reasons why it was formed.
Okay, yeah.
That way, I think I'll have a better idea. And I'm gonna actually begin with what I was talking about with like the Society of American Indians, which often gets written off as, kind of like a liberal, like assimilationist. And, there are tendencies within that, and it's important to hold that in your mind. But Society of American Indians was founded in like the 1910s. It was modeled after the National Congress of, or what is it called? NAACP. I can't remember. It's modeled after that. And, it drew a lot of inspiration and support from somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois. But where they ran into kind of trouble, because they're advocating for Native rights. We weren't technically citizens at the time. We didn't get citizenship citizenship wasn't imposed until 1924. But there were figures such as like the Apache medical doctor Carlos Montezuma, who was former SAI member, Society of American Indians member, and he actually became very militant and opposed to World War One, and he actually drew suspicion by the federal government. He actually protested this 1917 Selective Service Act. This is a quote from him. He says, "It tells the country that we are competent soldiers," meaning the Selective Service Act, "but we are not competent citizens. We are nothing but wards. We are not citizens, and we are without a country in this world. The wards are called upon to protect the protectors." This actually drew surveillance, by what later became the FBI. And they were surveilling people such as the socialist presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs, who was actually charged with under the Espionage Act and the 1918 Sedition Act, and he was imprisoned for this. And so they were actually thinking that Native people might join this. And it's important to also point out that that there was the Green Corn Rebellion in 1917 that opposed the draft as well, and it was led by Muskogee, IWW, International or Industrial Workers of the World, people who had allied with sharecroppers, black sharecroppers, and white sharecroppers in Oklahoma, and planned an uprising to protest the war. So this idea that somehow indigenous people in this time period were passive or whatever, complacent, is completely, the evidence doesn't bear out. And later on, of course, you get the formation of the FBI, which was modeled in Hoover's image. And, as much as the FBI likes to promote itself as like a crime fighting unit, it cut its teeth under Hoover, as basically being political police. And this is important to remember as well, because you have the what is that the Osage murders. There's a new movie coming out about it. What is it called? The Summer of the Flowering Moon or something like that. Summer.
Oh, I totally just saw a commercial for this shit.
Yeah, so Summer of the Flower Moon. Or wait, Killers of the Flower Moon. I apologize.
Yeah, I have it. Actually, I have the somebody just recommended that on TrueAnon, I want to say, the book that it's based off of. So like I was like, oh man, okay.
This is like propaganda, you know. This is like, so like basically it paints the FBI as these heroic figures who go in and investigate this series of Osage murders and murders of Oklahoma natives, because there was like, they were basically implementing a process of conservatorship, much like Free Britney movement, by the way. It has, of everything is settler colonial. Like even Free Britney is settler colonial. But basically, like, much like, you know, how Britney Spears was put into a conservatorship by her parents, Native people were considered incompetent and put into conservatorships by guardians, which were mainly like white dudes, who basically were trying to steal oil wealth from Osage people, because there was oil discovered there. There was a huge boom, and they would go in and they would target women specifically. And, you know, there's awful accounts. I don't have time to get into it. But like Zeke Kalasha, who was Ihongtoa, she was, you know, a product of the boarding school era, also a member of SAI, did amazing reporting on it. Advocacy in Congress. She's not, they didn't even bother to fucking list her in, you know, in the movie or even in the book that came out. It's as if like we're just hapless victims. I just wanted to point that out. So if you watch that movie, like think about it, because think about the way it paints the FBI. When there were indigenous activists who were on the ground, like advocating for tribal nations during this time. So yeah, like the FBI has long engaged in like this public relations campaign to portray itself in a positive light. There's all these FBI movies, right? There's the Killers of the Flower Moon, right? We have coming out, like, and it's kind of weird that they came out with it in this moment in time, because you have MMIW, you know, like in the national attention, like murder missing indigenous women, and now they're saying like, oh, the FBI has always been on this, and it's like, wait a second, like when have you been investigating murdered missing indigenous women?
Well,
when
if you think about
care?
If you actually think about it, it kind of makes sense that this movie is coming out as the 50th anniversary of AIM is coming up in 2 years, where there is going to be people bringing up anime repeatedly, because it is a constant, you know, it's one of those stories that vilifies AIM perfectly, you know?
Yeah, and we'll get into that. I mean, that's a
whole episode and a book and a podcast.
So the FBI is really created in the image of somebody like Hoover, who's like, you know, he's a character. You know, there's a lot to say about him, but he wasn't, you know, there's a lot of criticism about him not actually ever like really being a cop. Like he was just more of a desk, you know, a desk monkey, and sitting behind his desk, you know, issuing orders and things like that. So he wanted to portray this tough guy image. And so even the crime fighting thing, you know, they went after Dillinger and all that stuff. It was, most of their work was basically targeting immigrants who held leftist views, you know. And so it's important to put that out there, and to think about how the FBI becomes this sort of bloated bureaucracy, this institution who like just essentially justifies its own existence because it's surveilling, you know, or collecting intelligence on, you know, the daily lives of millions of people, right? Like millions of people, not in 2021 terms, but millions of people in like 1920s and 1930s terms.
Writing everything on a piece of paper, notepads.